were doing the Te, we talked about how there was a square at the center of the discussion of Te. And those 4 chapters, we made something up. Next week we'll come to the 4 chapters that make the square at the center of the discussion of Tao. Now those chapters will be 18, 19, 20, and 21. And if you get a chance during the week, there's no particular assignment, but if you get a chance, chapter 18 is the beginning of that particular square. And the title of chapter 18, which we won't get to, of course, tonight, Vulgarity's Palliation, as it's called here. And that's what Lao Tzu is talking about in chapter 18 is the way in which the vulgarity of the world is always something that is not given out, but thrown up. If you have equilibrium in yourself, your energy is not going to be thrown away by throwing it. If you have equilibrium within, then what comes out of you is a resonance of that equilibrium. The ancient saying in the high Middle Ages in the West was that if you make your heart a bell, God will strike that bell, and the sound of your clarity will fill your community. So the whole notion here that we're building to in the discussion of Tao is that the importance of Tao is not that we can make it work, but that we let it work. And by letting it work, we have to develop a technique of not interfering with our wholeness. And if we don't interfere with our wholeness, when we bring ourselves into juxtaposition with others, if they have any intuition at all, they will sense our togetherness, and we will evoke out of them their togetherness. So it's very, very important to do. Now these 4 chapters that we have tonight, 14, 15, 16, and 17, 14 is the most difficult. 14 is almost impossible. Now let me give you the translation of chapter 14. A very good scholar, Wing Sit Chan, who was a professor for many, many decades, very famous. You can find his books all over the place, a great big huge fat book called Source Book of Chinese Philosophy, published by Princeton University Press, is his. So he knows a lot. But in my estimation, he misses the meaning of chapter 14. Just as our other translation that I brought tonight, Hendricks, excellent scholar, without a doubt, recent publication. In my estimation, he misses what chapter 14 has to offer. Why would such experts, or would-be experts, why do they, in my estimation, miss? Because they do not have in themselves the kind of really subtle, perfected equilibrium which Lao Tzu has. So that when Lao Tzu writes, his writing is a resonance of his own equilibrium. And in order to get to what he says, we have to let him evoke from us our equilibrium, which is different from academic learning, which is different from philosophic background, which is different from being an expert. Because the main trigger of action here is, can you be simply who you are. If you can be simply who you are, Lao Tzu's words will evoke out of you a resonance of your own wholeness. And it is the universal principle. All resonance of wholenesses interpenetrate without leaving a trace. They come together and become one thing. It's like the mother who looks at the young child with love, or the young child looks at the mother with love. They're looking at each other, it becomes a single love. It would do a disservice to try and perceptually differentiate the two by conceptually snipping the gaze between them. And then you would hold up the mother and say, well, this is the look in her eyes, and hold up the child, this is the look in the child's eyes. Do they go together? Well, you already have created a false problem. Because the look in her eyes is for the child. The look in the child's eyes is for the mother. And they're looking to each other, for each other, becomes one thing. So Lao Tzu, in chapter 14, is saying that there is a quality which escapes notice if you're looking to see what it is that you're looking at instead of looking at the looking. Instead of letting the looking happen conscientiously. And so he says, looking itself, not seen, named thus, colorless. Here's how Lin Chen makes his translation. We look at it and do not see it. Now this makes a false problem. Because one immediately asks, what is it that we would look at and not see? And the answer to that question is that it must be invisible. Now this whole issue of invisible, or partly invisible, is like one of the major sand traps. I'm using a golf metaphor. It's a sand trap in metaphysics. Because someone says, oh, well, it isn't really material. It's like very subtle material. It must be psychic material. It must be subtle. So then they go through grades of manifestation. Gross manifestation, subtler manifestation, astral plane manifestation. When the whole realization is that there is nothing at all hidden or occult about being conscious that seeing itself is at least as important as anything seen. So that when you look, if you sensitize yourself, you can look to experience the looking and not let the object that you see commandeer all of your attention. Now it's very difficult to do this because our whole worldly experience is always to look at what you're doing. What Lao Tzu is saying in chapter 14, that there's a quality, a knack, of being able to experience your looking and not have to have it bump into any particular object. And that when you experience your looking, or you experience your hearing in this way, you can also experience your coming to grasp without having to hold something, without having to actually seize something, your whole ability to grasp a situation becomes something that can be done with no hands. How can you grasp a situation without hands? You do it all the time, for instance, when you're a child and you're learning to ride a bicycle. You're not holding your arms up to balance yourself. Once you learn to balance yourself, you can do it without hands, without arms. So that there's a spiritual balance. A spiritual balance. When that spiritual balance is there, the psychic energy, because it doesn't have any particular direction given to it by your will, by a sense of purpose, the psychic energy calms down, spreads out, and becomes like a very clear pool. And you can experience this in prayer or in meditation, the way in which one can calm oneself down so that your psychic energy, instead of normally having waves in it, either really huge waves because you're anxious, or little tiny waves because you're trying to maintain your balance, or you're fidgeting about it. There is an equanimity in which there are no waves whatsoever. In that condition, psychic energy, like a still pool, gets a reflective quality. What would it reflect? It reflects its own structure of balance. That is to say, not a visual structure of balance, but the term is kinesthetic. The kinesthetic quality of being balanced. So that we would use the popular phrase in American slang, being together. Or the 60s phrase was, we can't put it together, it is together. Here's how Hendricks translates this. We look at it, but do not see it. You notice that the word it dominates his line, his sentence. So itness is the quality that you're hit with right away, and of course, the natural tendency is to say, what is it? I think Alan Watts wrote a book called What Is It? The Book of the It. If you fall into that kind of metaphysical sand trap, then the it becomes a very problematic, in philosophy it's called a quandary, some question that's not solvable. There's no particular answer. There are two really good answers, and you can't choose between the two. A conundrum or a quandary. So what happens psychologically is when you have a problem which has two equal solutions that you cannot choose between them, psychologically, the human mind does a little bit of sleight of hand. The human mind equivocates the two and says that they're identical. And then says, this is identical to this, and mistakes that identification for equanimity. Identification is a long, long ways from equanimity. There's no Tao in identification. There's no Te in equivocation whatsoever. It only means then that you're caught in an exact 50-50 limbo. The phrase that I used to hear when I was a boy, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of another. And the psychological feeling tone that comes out of that is that it doesn't really matter. And of course, if you come to the feeling tone that it doesn't really matter, then what's the big deal? And you forget about the whole situation. This is the taproot of the ignorance of the world. False identification. Pseudo-equivocation. based on making a false problem seem like the issue, and this use of it is philosophically very vague. Well, let's follow Hendricks through. We look at it but do not see it. We name this the minute. We listen to it but do not hear it. We name this the rarefied. We touch it but do not hold it. We name this the level and smooth. These three cannot be examined to the limit. Thus they merge together as one. One, there is nothing more encompassing above it, and nothing smaller below it. Boundless, formless, it cannot be named, and returns to the state of no thing. Now, psychologically, this is what we would call gobbledygook. It's a very fancy way of making a short circuit, of stretching out an equivocation so that it sounds like you're saying something, but what actually has happened is that you have come from it to no thing. Then, having done that, subconsciously, and accepted that, Hendricks finishes his translation of chapter 14 in this way. This is called the formless form. Now, to use language in that way, formless form, it's a non sequitur. To say that there is a formless form defeats the whole differentiation process. It leaves you adrift. And he goes on to say, the substanceless image. It's a kind of an astral plane projection. This is called the subtle and indistinct. Follow it and you won't see its back. Greet it and you won't see its head. Hold on to the way of the present to manage the things of the present and to know the ancient beginning. This is called the beginning of the thread of the way. Now, when you're left with that, you're left. You're left behind. Why? Because emotionally you didn't go anywhere. Psychologically you didn't understand anything. Now it's this kind of translation that seems to be very accurate, very scholarly, and leads people to consider that the Chinese somehow are kind of inscrutable. Who knows about that? When actually, Lao Tzu is very much like us, very homey. He appreciates exactly what we appreciate. Here's Wing Tse Chan's translation, which goes even farther afield. Not so philosophically subtle in its logical misstructuring as Hendricks, but here's Wing Tse Chan leading us away. We look at it and do not see it. Its name is the invisible. We listen to it and do not hear it. Its name is the inaudible. We touch it and do not find it. Its name is the subtle, formless. These three cannot be further inquired into and hence merge into one. Going up high, it is not bright, and coming down low, it is not dark. Infinite and boundless, it cannot be given any name. It reverts to nothingness. Now this whole thing, it reverts to nothingness. Now reverting to nothingness, again, is one of these short circuits. It's misusing language. This is called shape without shape. That's like formless form, shape without shape. It's bending language back so far that instead of being paradoxical, it's clever. A kind of a cleverness which becomes fragile. And the more that you try to deal with language in this way, the more in its fragility it breaks down. It doesn't work. Someone who would actually be able to think this way for a couple of weeks would become convinced of the necessity for silence and would tend to counter any discussion with the Tao with just silence. It's an exhausting misuse of language. Form without objects. It is the vague and elusive. Meet it and you will not see its head. Follow it and you will not see its back. Hold on to the Tao of old in order to master the things of the present. From this one may know the primeval beginning of the universe. This is called the Bond of Tao. Now these are two of the very best translations there are of the Tao Te Ching. Out of the 70 or so other translations in English, they're very much less than this, and yet these two do not convey what Lao Tzu has said in chapter 14. And we'll get to some of the work that you've done on this a little later. I've tried to put Lao Tzu's language, character for word, into a kind of a poetic form, so as to just let him talk that talk. Let him say in the way in which he, characteristically in Chinese, has his say. And it's like this. The chapter's title is Praising the Profound. Now for Lao Tzu, the profound is that when you lead up to, through a sequence of transformation, to a certain point of fulfillment, if you look over the brink of fulfillment, there is nothing further to go. And so the transformation, instead of going further, goes through a return to Tao. But it will only go through that return to Tao if you have let the flow of all the other transformations build enough fullness so that it can make that return back to Tao. The fuel for that fullness is our equilibrium. If we have not added our equilibrium, the transformations will not have enough energy to accumulate the fullness of profundity so that the return to the Tao will occur. Here's how chapter 14 reads if Lao Tzu could speak English. Looking itself, not seen, named thus colorless. Listening itself, not heard, named thus soundless. Grasping itself, not tenable, named thus incorporeal. These three themselves not can be subject objectivity. These three themselves not can be subject objectivity. Therefore twined, yet busy unity. Its surface not clear, its bottom not obscure, continuously. Oh, not can name, reverts, returns to no thing existence. This called no form itself, the form of no image itself, image. This form, abstrusely abstruse, the front itself not seen its head, the rear itself not seen its back, holding fast, ancient, itself Tao, thereby govern how its existence, thus no ancient beginning. This is called Tao's thread. When this particular chapter in the Tao Te Ching came into play later on in Oriental history, later Chinese history, about the 1100s, 1200s, this particular quality of understanding influenced Buddhism enormously. In one of the sects of Buddhism that was influenced, this whole thing about the thread, the Tao's thread, became something whereby a thread was led out from an image of a certain aspect of the Buddha, and the person who would be suffering would hold the other end of the thread and just progressively let go of their problems. Just let them go. And the understanding was that they would travel by this thread to the Buddha, who would dispose of those problems in the right way and exchange with you for your problems the healing equanimity of the Buddha. And that this two-way exchange would happen by means of this simple little thread. This is like making an exterior ritual, religious practice out of what here in the Tao Te Ching is a very subtle, natural occurrence. You cannot have problems if you do not hold on to them. The only reason why you have problems at all is that you continue to hold on to them. If you let them go, you also let go not only of the problems, but of the need for an answer. When you have let go of both the problems and the need for an answer, you are not left empty. It would seem at first that you're empty because you've been holding on to problems and the need to find answers to match them for so long that when you do manage to let them go, it seems as if there is a gap, something missing, an emptiness, a vacuity. But actually what happens is that as you relax into what you thought was a vacuity, it becomes the equilibrium. Because having let go of the problems and the need for answers, you get into that situation where looking itself occurs to you as something happening and not just objects that are looked at. In that state of awareness where hearing itself becomes something and not any particular sound that you might hear. And then grasping itself, the ability to comprehend, becomes apparent to you as a faculty of your true self, and that you don't have to be grasping anything in order for your comprehension to be real. You don't have to comprehend something to make your comprehensibility quality real. At that point, at the point where that would occur to you, you would realize, it would be an instantaneous realization, that one of the reasons of holding on to problems is that they were life preservers, seeming life preservers, so that you would not experience the vacuity of not having problems. That terrible as the problems were, they were preferable to the intuitive state of having nothing. But in fact, you do not have nothing. What you have is your primordial reality, which is in equilibrium, which is in correspondence with Tao. And when that Tao spontaneously occurs, leaps into the correspondence with your reality, whatever it is that you do has the resonance of that correspondence. It doesn't matter what you do. You're not going to transgress nature or your own person, and you're free to do whatever it is that you are doing. It's a very, very, very interesting situation. So here is chapter 14, praising the profound, one more time. Looking itself, not seen, named thus colorless. Listening itself, not heard, named thus soundless. Grasping itself, not tenable, named thus incorporeal. These three themselves not can be subject objectivity. I can't make them as a subject my objectivity. I can't make the soundless hearing, the colorless seeing, the ungrasping comprehension. I can't make them objective to my subject when they're just left to be as they are. When they're just left to be as they are, what do? They occur in such a way that they come together resonantly. And if you had some kind of a kinesthetic sense, they would come together like the strands of DNA would come together. They would curl around each other just by nature and occur together in a braided kind of effect. Why would that be? Lao Tzu says, therefore, twined, yet busy unity, its surface not clear. In other words, there's no cut-out shape to its surface. Its bottom not obscure. Nevertheless, there's a very definite, intuitive sense that this is real. It's real despite not having a seen shape. It's real despite not having a heard form. It's real despite not being something that you grasp, and yet it is comprehensible without having to be grasped. And so Lao Tzu says, continuously, continuously. Oh, not can name. And at the point where you know that you're not going to name it, you experience that it is real but not nameable, that's the Tao. Already. And it means already that the returns to no thing existence. Zero base, the Tao. This called no form itself. The form of no image itself image. This form, abstrusely abstruse, He means to say in here, abstruse is a word for not so much subtle, but something which has transcended the way in which it originally occurred. Something that is abstruse is alchemically distilled out of where it originally was. Say, like, you have a ton of ore from a mine, and you, by a distillation process, take the metal out of that ore. That metal is abstruse in comparison to that ore. But now if you fashion that metal into a shape, like a knife, like a sword, that knife or that sword compared to the ore is abstrusely abstruse. It doesn't mean that it gets right to the edge of vanishing out of sight. It means it comes to the form in which now it is used in our realm of application. What is being used that is abstrusely abstruse? And who is using it? Tao is being used, and we are using it. How do we use it? How do we use this form, abstrusely abstruse? Lao Tzu says, the front itself, not seeing its head. The rear itself, not seeing its back. Who does not see the head? One does not see one's own head and see. Who does not see the back? One does not see one's own back. In other words, when we come to be able to use the Tao in its sword-like pristine form, we use it in our reality and not in some other version like the ego or some expectant role or some mask. But I myself, seeing my seeingness, I myself hearing my hearingness, I myself comprehending my comprehension. And so Lao Tzu says, the front itself, not seeing its head, and the rear itself, not seeing its back, holding fast in this non-grasping way, is ancient. Itself Tao. Thereby govern now its existence. Thus no ancient beginning. This is called Tao's thread. He's saying that the ancients who were able to practice this for themselves are no different from us when we practice this precisely and exactly. The ancients and us and the Tao come to one thing. We come to a unity which is seamless. So that the phrase that's sometimes used is that when you get used to, for the first time, of really being able to just settle into your real nature, you feel like an ancient child in this world. You feel fresh and new, yet very wise anciently. You know all this. You know you've seen this a million times before. So that the Tao, when it occurs in the spiritual personality, it doesn't occur as vacuity, it occurs as one's indelible eternal self. So that chapter 15, revealing Te, goes to the other side of this, and in my translation runs like this. Ancients themselves, completely accomplished masters, ones, subtle, spiritual, profound, resonant. Now sometimes the character that I've translated as resonant is translated as penetrating. But the character for profound and for resonant go together, so that sometimes they're translated like in Wing Sit Chan here. He translates it as profoundly penetrating. And he has a little note here, and he reads here the two characters, Xuan Tong, profound penetration, is also interchangeable with Xuan Tong, profound identification. And one gets back into this problem. Identification is a false unity. Let me put it simpler for you. An identification is A equals A. There is a world of difference, logically, between A equals A and A. I need to tell you a little logical story. One of the most profound of all the logical minds at the beginning of the 20th century was Bertrand Russell. And he was a young genius at Cambridge University in England when it was filled with young geniuses. Sri Aurobindo was there, Bertrand Russell, Wittgenstein, and a man named G.E. Moore. It was one of these Englishmen who was sort of playful, must have had some Welsh or leprechaun blood or something. Anyway, Russell came in one day to Moore's lodgings, and there was a big, huge, roaring fireplace, and Moore with a blanket over his lap, and he had a bowl in his lap. It was filled with some apples. And Russell was hungry, and he said, Moore, do you have some apples in that bowl? And Moore looked up, got a twinkle in his eyes, covered the bowl, and he said, no. And so Russell, who was very sharp, very young, took the bait and he said, Moore, do you have any apples in that bowl? And Moore, looking at him very directly, slight grin, said, no. Finally, Russell, figuring out the exact game that was being played with him, said, Moore, have you apples in that bowl? And Moore said, yes, would you like one? Logically, you must mean what you say. And the only way to mean what you say is you must say it directly so that you have said what you mean. What is the subtlety in all this? The subtlety is this. Language has its own laws. Language has its own built-in structure, which comes into play all by itself when you use it. And that the deep, ancient resonance of your spirit spontaneously and intuitively knows the subtle differentiations of the structure of language from the word go. But our worldly self, our ego, usually is untrained as to the hidden structure of language. And so in a clumsy way, we try to buffalo our way through the world by misusing language. But the spirit will not awaken to a misuse of language. The spirit only evocatively responds when truth is spoken exactly in the way in which it must be said. It's like most of the miracles in the New Testament are directly attributable to Jesus being able to speak truth, and speak truth truthfully. Not misusing language in a worldly way at all, but directly evoking what was true then and there of that person. And when you evoke a wholeness of someone, like a spontaneous volcano, they completely transcend the worldly problem area which was holding them down. It doesn't take any time at all. No time lapses whatsoever. Do we need to change our film? Do we need to change our tapes? Lao Tzu speaks in this way, and I'm putting his language into English so that he can speak in this way. Now, chapter 15, Revealing Tao. I thought so. I can feel there are little nice.
That was 2 minutes off.
So you're becoming spiritual athletes. Look how it takes practice to do this. And look, if you do not practice in the right way, you don't gain capacity. If you don't exercise the right muscles in the right way, they don't strengthen. You can do all the push-ups you want, and it's not going to do much for your calves. They're different muscles. Psychic energy is just that way. You have to exercise psychic energy in just the right way. What is the right way? In a pattern of fullness. If you go in for most of the high-powered teachings that are mowing human beings down the planet wide now, you become like these multi-million-dollar athletes who develop all these special exercises and special muscles, and when they go out to play the game, they just show up injured in a week. In Major League Baseball, there are a couple hundred professional athletes on the disabled list. When I was a boy, there might have been 2 or 3 people on the disabled list. Why? Because if you do not develop the body as a whole, so that every exercise brings the body as a whole into play and then develops the special muscle. If you do it the other way, you develop the special muscles, you never get to the whole body. So when you need to use the whole body, you're going to throw something out. The same thing with the psyche. Most metaphysical teachings today are complete travesty. They're nonsense. Because the whole pattern of the psyche is like a wheel around a single center. And the hub at that center of the psyche is the spirit. But instead of being a point which is there, the spirit is a focus which is not there except as a focus. And so the spirit is not even accessible unless the pattern of the psyche as a whole is brought into play as a whole. When the psyche as a whole is brought into play, the spiritual focus is there. And that's where the equilibrium is. Because the psyche is made to spin. And if it doesn't have its center pivot on narrowness, the spinning will never be perfectly smooth. And you'll never get that mirror-like calmness. See the reflection of the pattern of existence itself. So Lao Tzu is speaking in this way. He's saying the ancients knew this. Not only did they know this, they did this. They didn't do this in specific things, but they did this in being themselves completely. So he says, ancients themselves completely accomplished masters, ones, subtle, spiritual, profound, resonant. Completeness not can be categorized. Since not can be categorized, therefore, try to make themselves intelligible, cautious. Oh, like winter wading a stream, reluctant. Oh, like fearing four-quarter neighbors, reserved. Oh, they like visitants, elusive. Oh, like plain wood, blank. Oh, they like valleys, obscure. Oh, they like turbulent water. Turbulent water thereby quiet itself gradually, purify. Quiet thereby moving itself gradually into life. Keep this down. Not wish to be filled, since not to be filled, therefore able, old, not new, fashion. He say, when you come to be exactly who you are, you will discover that it's not a new creation. You didn't just do this for yourself. You have always been this way. But you just now rediscovered that. When you become yourself, you become who anciently you always have been. This is the proof in the whole process. It's not that you feel good. It's not that you have wealth. It's not that you have happiness. What happens is that you occur as you really are. And you recognize that you have never been other than this except in an ignorant situation which had you hypnotized away from being your own self. And that when you are your own self, when you are your ancient eternal self, the Tao flows through you like it has always flowed through you, and your life then becomes a resonance of the Tao and your spiritual eternality. And Lao Tzu many times in the Tao Te Ching says, that person has nothing to fear from any situation, anywhere, at any time. Why? Because the resonance of wholeness that comes out from us evokes only the wholeness of the world. And we participate in a new selection of the world, a selection that is responsive to our wholeness, who we really are. Those people that we meet are resonant with us as we really are. Those situations that occur are resonant with us in our real mode. The events that happen are resonant with our real happening. And when persons, situations, and events come to one thing, resonant with our spiritual equanimity, Tao flows through all of that seamlessly. And the ecology of the energy cycle, the 5 phase energy cycle, spins. And that's what's called in Buddhism the Dharma chakra. The wheel of truth. Wheel of truth. Here's chapter 16. Its title, I've translated as Recycling the Root. Here's the root. Okay, the root grows, and carry on the metaphor, out comes the plant. First, little sprouts, little leaves, gather some sunlight, some stalk. Out of the stalk comes the bud, and out of the bud comes the flower. The flower comes the fruit. The fruit, the seed that goes down, makes the root. We're all familiar with that. Recycling the root. he's going to go two different ways. He's going to go to the vanishing point, and he's going to bring the vanishing point back into its fullness. So he says it this way: attain vacuity's apex, plumb tranquility's essence. The 10,000 things together rise. When you do this, when this ecology, like a completed breath, is a microcosm of this completed ecology, attain vacuity's apex by breathing out. You can breathe out just so far. That's vacuity's apex. Plumb tranquility's essence. Just let the breath come back in. Attain vacuity's apex. Plumb tranquility's essence. The 10,000 things together rise. I thereby recognize their returning. Really, things bloom, each returns, recycles its root. Recycle the root is called tranquility. This is called return designation. Returning designation means eternal. Knowing eternal means enlightenment. Not knowing eternal, disorder arises, evil. Knowing eternal, comprehensive. Comprehensive indicates breadth. Breadth indicates the kingly. Kingly indicates heavenly. And heavenly indicates Tao. Tao indicates everlasting. The end of the body, then, is not dangerous. He's saying that in this breath of the eternal, when one has become resonant to its ecology, its motion of truth, the body loses its fullness, and when the fullness is through, the body goes back, and it's not a dangerous situation, you continue. So, chapter 17, to complete the four, is very short. It's called Simplicity's Regimen. Notice now that recycling the root went with praising the profound, with that chapter 14 that you all struggled with. Recycling the root goes with that. Revealing Tao, chapter 15, goes with Simplicity's Regimen. Remember that revealing Tao, ancients themselves, completely accomplished masters. They were all ones. They all shared the unity of Tao, the oneness of Tao. Subtle, spiritual, profound, resonant completeness that could not be categorized. So here's chapter 17, Simplicity's Regimen. He's going to talk about the way in which human beings in this world respond to levels of fulfillment. And he says that the very highest ones are not even seen to be superior, to be supreme. The supreme highest, inferiors not know existence of them. The next, attached to them, praise them. The next are those models or those leaders or those persons as figures that we attach ourselves to and we praise them. But the next lower, we fear them. And the next lower, we despise them. Therefore, notice that Lao Tzu is always bringing therebys and therefores. He's showing us a kind of a situation which is profoundly true. Somebody who is really perfected, the world doesn't even see. And a right truth, they don't even know. They kick in on their identification level. At the next level down, and those people, they say, oh, those are fantastic people. Just look at those movie stars. Look at those sports heroes. But then the next, we fear those. Those people have too much power. Those people have too much money. What's going on? But the next down, they despise those. Those people, well, they're the ones. Lao Tzu says, therefore, faith not sufficient affirmation. Why? Why is faith not a sufficient affirmation in Lao Tzu? Don't get Christianity mixed up in it. Why in Lao Tzu is faith not a sufficient affirmation? Because you only have faith at the level at which you're operating. If you're dealing at the level where you despise somebody, you really have faith that you're despising them is true. Well, look at those people. Or if you're praising somebody, you have faith that your praise is well placed. Look at those people. But the very highest, perfected spiritual gem, they don't even see it. There's no faith that comes into play there at all. This is why, like in ancient Christianity, one was taught to have knowledge and not to just rely on faith. Faith must be matured into knowledge. Pistis must be matured into gnosis. Why? Because if you don't know how to know, you never see the highest. You never see the perfected. Therefore, faith not sufficient affirmation. Find not faith reluctantly. Oh, they value language, merit doing deeds, accentuate the 100 families, all say, we are self-so. In other words, there's a particular kind of a trap in this world. The trap is that we do not, in our everyday normal mode of conducting ourselves, able to see what's real. The best that we do is we see some kind of derivative and take that as a model and think people that approximate that are really something. Or people that don't quite approximate that, we suspect them, we fear them. But people that fall way down from that, we despise them. All of these levels, all of these horizons of regard, all of these levels of comportment, each would have their own kind of faith. If you have the highest kind of faith, it would transform into knowing. Because on that highest level, one would have to leave the world, leaving us behind. One would have to leave the world of problems and the need for answers behind and come back to your true self. Now, we unfortunately live in such a junkyard. We think that only high spiritual leaders at the cream of the cream have ever known this and ever written on this. And this is simply not true. 3 or 4 generations ago, in this particular country, it was common knowledge. Our president, 60 years ago, Woodrow Wilson, wrote a little book called When a Man Comes to Himself. That's very, very, very similar to the world's great wisdom. When a person comes to themselves, you get a feeling, a taste for wholeness. And for people who have that taste for wholeness, and you get used to doing things in your life in terms of wholeness and not just piecemeal. And so you look to see that your activities are patterned and that the patterns match up with the patterns of your wholeness, so that what you do fits in with who you really are. And that those people who are involved in your life are really understanding that you're living this life as fully as you can. Your whole spectrum of person is coming into play in this whole pattern. You're living a life. And if they're going to be coming into contact with you, it's not on grabbing your hand or your wallet or any other aspect of you, but accepting your wholeness, your patterned wholeness. Which means then that it's like resonances, because you're accepting not them because they're tall, dark, and handsome, or not them because they have stock portfolio that fills a whole suitcase. You're accepting in your wholeness of pattern, their wholeness of pattern, and it's like this whole resonance completely overshadows what identification lies about. Identification is just bringing two things together, and it's usually on the basis of a deferred conflict. Whereas the bringing of two resonant patterns together, the psychological term in antiquity for that is one that Carl Jung brought back into play. It's a very strange word. It's called syzygy. S-Y-Z-Y-G-Y. Syzygy. Too bad psychiatrists say that they understand syzygy to mean the meeting of opposites. Well, I'll tell you truthfully, and you can bear it out by physics. The only way that opposites come together is through tension. That's what the electric current is. So if you try to bring opposites together, you're going to make tension. Opposites don't go together, they make tension. So the reconciliation of opposites is a misunderstanding, a misstatement. It's like asking, do you have any apples in that basket? Even if you did, you wouldn't give them one. Because what they ask does not really occur, does not really happen. It's a misuse of the structures of language, and if you're really alert, you would respond to it. When two patterns come into play together, that resonance is so profound that we have a special word for it in music. It's called consonance. Consonance. And when you bring two full harmonies together, they meet in such a way that you cannot hear that there are two harmonies brought together. One thing. That's that unity that we talked about in chapter 14. These three themselves cannot be subject objectivity. Therefore twined, yet busy unity. And one of the false images here is that somehow a spiritual unity is going to be boring. You hear people glibly say, well, I don't want to go to heaven and just sit around and play a harp on a cloud all the time. At least something interesting is going to be happening in hell. It's a complete misunderstanding. It's not like the spirit is boring and the world is flashy. The world is about as bland as you can possibly get. This world is about as boring as things get. The whole thing about spirits. A good Scotch whiskey is a spirited drink. Why? Because the spirit has an effervescent quality that transcends dimensions. And while this world manages to limp along on only 4 dimensions, the spirit lives in a kaleidoscope of millions of dimensions. You can't imagine how bland this world is. It takes a great sacrifice to even kick around it. So when one talks about the unity, I translate it as busy unity. When seeing, seeingness, when hearing, hearingness, when comprehending, comprehension come into one thing as a very busy unity. It's kaleidoscopic is the word I would want to use. Kaleidoscopic. Its surface not clear, not because it's ambiguous, but because it so transcends the shape-making capacity of this world. And its bottom not obscure, because it really does occur, really does happen. Continuously. Continuously. He repeats the character. Continuously. Continuously. Oh, not can name. Not can name because it's a no thing. Take the it's out. Don't use that kind of equivocating pronoun because that traps one into assuming that you're talking about some object. There's no object there. There's a focus of concepts. And that's spiritual. That's quite different. Let's take off early. And if you can, we're going to go and have some Chinese food.